For this chapter, we are looking at interest groups, another example of a linkage institution. So this is one other way that citizens are able to connect with their government, influence the government, try to affect policies and make positive change in the government that is supposed to serve them. Woo! So I mentioned this before, but we want to make sure that we're clear on the difference between a political party and an interest group. So an interest group, for example, it says an organization of people who enter the political process to try to achieve their shared goals. And these are policy goals. Remember, political parties' goals are to get members elected to office. Interest groups are interested in affecting government so that they will implement policies that are important to these people. They support candidates, but don't run their own candidates for office. Remember, a political party will run candidates for office. An interest group will not, but they will find candidates who support the issues that are important to them, and they will support those candidates. So the interest group is very committed. They usually have a narrower focus than political parties. So for example, a political party platform has to cover a whole range of issues. Social issues, environmental issues, fiscal issues, whatever it's going to be, whereas an interest group usually just focuses on one issue. So it might be an interest group like the Sierra Club that's just worried about environmental issues or something like that. So interest groups are more focused, concerned with affecting their policy, not as concerned with trying to get members elected to office. That's what political parties are for. Political action committees are the political arm of interest groups, but I really think it might be appropriate to also call them, in many ways, financial arm. Look at my awesome handwriting on the iPad there. They raise money to give to parties or candidates, and we talked about this last time when we were talking about campaign finance reform. So one way that you can donate to candidates and circumvent some of the donation limits is by donating to a political action committee. So you donate the money to the political action committee that usually represents or is part of an interest group, and then they can give that money to candidates as well. In last class, we talked about the Campaign Reform Act of 1974 and why those restrictions led to an increase in the creation of PACs or political action committees. Remember, that's another way to donate money to candidates. But I don't want that just to have a negative connotation. Remember, that can be a good thing. For example, a candidate that is not independently wealthy, this is a way for them to get more funding and support so that they can be competitive in an election. And it's also a way for citizens, you and I, to donate money to causes that we think are important, and then enough of us donate a little bit of money, that ends up being a lot of money, and then that money can get donated back to the candidate and hopefully cause change, affect policy, and then government will implement the policies that we're concerned with. 527s, I think last class one of the periods asked about these. So 527s, the number refers to a section of the U.S. tax code that sort of made it possible for them to be created. It's whatever, it is what it is. Technically, a lot of things fall under the same part of the tax code, but when we're talking about 527s, we usually are more specifically referring to organizations that are created in such a way that allows them to avoid being regulated by the FEC, by the Federal Election Commission, FEC. Sometimes you'll see it that way on tests as well. So kind of try to be familiar with both. Like I said, similar to political action committees, but a little bit different in that they're less regulated. And one of the things is, don't worry about this part. I have an updated slide that I want you to see, but I guess I'll just tell you about it right now. One of the things that happens is there's limits on donating money to candidates, and this is similar to when we were talking about soft money versus hard money last time, is where you're trying to still help your candidate get elected, but you need to be a little bit sneaky about it and not follow, try to get around the wording of the law. And so oftentimes what 527s do is they will spend money on something that's called issue advocacy. And so they are spending money to inform the public on an issue which may make a candidate look bad, but that's not necessarily the explicit stated purpose. So by spending money on the issue, they can raise awareness about something that might cast, a candidate in a negative light that would make it more likely for them to be able to get elected. Okay, so Swift Boat Veterans for Truth was one that got a lot of attention when John Kerry was running for presidency. And what happened was the commercials they ran didn't say, don't vote for John Kerry, he's a bad person. What they did was they called into question his military experience and what he did, and tried to make him look less attractive as a candidate, and as I said, called into question his military service. And because they're not saying, don't vote for John Kerry, they're just saying, hey, we wanted to let you know this stuff about John Kerry that happens to make him look bad. And then there's a whole other dispute about whether or not the information they had was accurate, and on and on. But so we're not going to fall down that rabbit hole today. So sometimes you're going to see this reference to these different types or theories of interest group politics. So there's the elitist theory, there's the pluralist theory, and then I don't know if I've ever seen this one on the test, but hyper-pluralist theory. Elite theory, or people that follow this elitist theory, would argue that there are relatively few groups that have the most power, so sort of like the elites in society. So interest groups are a way to facilitate allowing like the wealthiest people or the most influential people to have the most power. So there might be other interest groups, but they're not as powerful as the relatively small number of very, very powerful ones. And so that is an argument that would make interest groups look more negative, and this is sort of one way of looking at it and classifying them. Then a pluralist theory would be more positive than this elitist one, saying that interest groups are basically good for everyone because it gives more people opportunities to be involved in government. Remember, we've talked about political efficacy. Can I cause change and affect the outcome of government? Interest groups are good because they provide an opportunity for more average citizens to work together to cause change, to affect policies for government. So that's pluralist theory in that way. Hyperpluralism or a hyperpluralist theory can be seen as kind of a combination of elitist and pluralist. Similar to pluralist, people who share interests can join together, forming groups and being able to affect government. Like elite theory, hyperpluralism suggests that some groups will wield too much power and have a disproportionate influence on the government. Hyperpluralists then argue a step further, saying that if there are too many groups that can affect government, then government essentially like shuts down because of a gridlock, that there's too many different competing groups vying for power, but they don't have sort of the cohesion that would be able to force a compromise between these different groups. I know this is not the most thrilling part of this chapter, but be familiar with these terms. They do show up occasionally on tests, and so it's something you should be familiar with. So we're going to quickly go through a couple different types of economic or interest groups. One would be economic interest groups. So labor unions oftentimes form an interest group, and that would be economic because it's working and jobs and things like that. Farmers have pretty powerful interest groups. Agriculture and farming concerns. Businesses, certainly very powerful interest groups are formed around businesses. So it might be like all manufacturers or all people in the finance industry or something like that. And then we also see what we're calling professional interest groups. And so like the American Medical Association is going to be all doctors, or we see different groups like that where it's grouped around a profession, usually something that is different from what you would see necessarily in a labor union, but something like doctors, lawyers, etc. Other types of interest groups, consumer interest groups, so consumer safety concerns or environmental interests. This doesn't really show up on tests very much. Equality interest groups, so the NAACP, we don't think of them traditionally as an interest group, but they certainly function that way because they are like-minded people that are trying to force change, supporting an agenda. So in this case, equal opportunities and more access for African Americans. Now, or the National Organization for Women, similarly about gender issues, and so they will raise money, people will donate, they will go out and support candidates, they will try to influence laws and things like that. The Anti-Defamation League and other types of groups you can see are going to be involved as well. And then now let's talk a little bit about lobbyists. So one thing that interest groups will do, lobbyists, I think I spelled that right, is this practice of lobbying. So they actually will hire people whose job it is to go and advocate for their cause. And so, again, trying to influence government policies, that's what interest groups' main goal is. They will contact officials, they will go and try to meet with these public officials, they will try to take these officials to lunch, and they'll testify at committee hearings. I'll talk more about that in a second. What this does is this is really just trying to convey information to lawmakers. And so what they want to do is they want to contact the lawmakers, senators, representatives, whomever it might be, and say, here is a good policy and here's why you should implement it. Let me show you, my data and my graph on why this is going to be good for the economy or why this will help, whatever. They want to convey that information. What that means is oftentimes, when can I have an opportunity to talk to you? So if that means taking the official to lunch, that's an opportunity. Now, we oftentimes think of this as like shady and bribery, and certainly that happens sometimes, but otherwise it's not necessarily a bad thing. The goal is to educate and give information to the people that have to make these decisions. And that's a good thing. We want our leaders to be educated about these issues. And so a lobbyist oftentimes is going to be an expert in a policy area that they can talk about because they have experience working in that area or whatever it is. Oftentimes lobbyists are former legislators themselves, and so that is what makes sense for a company to want to hire a lobbyist who used to be in Congress. So like a former Congress person would be a good lobbyist, because when they say, hey, I want to take you to lunch and talk to you about this industry that I'm representing, the people they're taking to lunch are people that they were co-workers with for years and years, and so they're more likely to have access and be able to communicate in that way and be able to say, here's why voting this way is beneficial. So that certainly benefits. And then down here you can see testifying at committee hearings. We've talked about that in the lawmaking process with the committee hearings at the subcommittee and at the committee level. And so what happens is who's going to go and be the expert to talk about what we should do, what types of regulations we should pass. And lobbyists are oftentimes those people that are called to do that. That might be their job, to speak on behalf of an interest group, to represent a point of view, or to represent whatever that concern is. And so testifying at committee hearings is a very important function of lobbyists, because they're the experts in that area. I mean, ideally you'll have someone on both sides of the issue, but still these are the people that want to go, and it really comes down to wanting to convey information. That's their main goal. Another thing that interest groups try to do, we'll call electioneering. I don't see this on tests very much, but it's kind of a no-duh thing. What they do is they want to spend their money to help certain people get elected. And as we mentioned earlier, mostly political action committees are going to be involved in spending that money. So they say, this is an issue that's important to us. We want to, do regulation to save more trees. Here's a candidate that has promised to do that, to save more trees. And so what we will do is we will donate our money to the candidate who loves trees. That's what we mean by electioneering. Another tool that interest groups will use is litigation. In other words, they will sue the government or businesses to force them to change. So maybe there is a law that's in place that says you have to act a certain way, so maybe an anti-pollution law, and for whatever reason the government's not enforcing it. They could sue the business, or they could sue the government saying you need to enforce this law. And so sometimes it's like, if they feel that the legislative branch or the executive branch isn't addressing an issue that's important, they will try to find an opportunity to take that issue to court, and then have the judicial branch try to rectify whatever the issue is. Another role that interest groups will play in litigation is writing amicus curiae briefs, which we've talked about in a couple of units ago. So they will write in a court case that they're interested in and sort of say, hey, we want to add to this conversation. We have more information, something to say. So we'll write this amicus curiae brief trying to say why ruling one way or another is a good thing. And then also becoming involved in class action lawsuits. So maybe if it's a consumer interest group, they're going to act on behalf of a bunch of people that were ripped off, or were unjustly treated by a company, or could be anything like that. So So another tool that the interest groups have that they can use is to make a direct appeal to the public and try to rally more support. So support beyond just the members of the interest group. So who else can help? And so that might be accessing the media, trying to get on a TV show or a talk show, or maybe running commercials or something else like that. And so really trying to cultivate their public image, and so that people have a positive association and are more willing to support them and support the causes that they are interested in. So what makes a interest group effective? Obviously, the more people that you have, the more money and votes that you're going to have. So even if you don't have, tons of money, if you have tons and tons of people, those people can go vote, and those people can mobilize, and those people can go out and knock on doors, or write letters, or a bunch of different things. And so obviously it helps if you have both of these things. But if you only have one, you still can be pretty powerful. One of the issues, though, that comes up sometimes is what's called a free rider problem, where if people can benefit from the work of the interest group without actually having to be part of the interest group, without contributing to that. So, for example, AAA, the American Automobile Association, is actually an interest group as well, and so they will advocate on your behalf as a motorist, and so they will do things like lobby state legislature to try to lower taxes on gas or something like that, or improve roads, spend more money on nicer roads. Even if you're not a member of AAA, you still can benefit from that. And so why bother joining AAA? AAA will do all the work for me and try to lower gas taxes or improve roads. So why should I bother? That's what's called the free rider problem, is that if people can benefit from the work of the interest group without actually having to put any effort in themselves. Single issue groups tend to be the most intense. They tend to feel very strongly about their one issue. You get people fired up like that. And the other thing that we talked about here with money is the same thing as financial resources. So the more financial resources industry group has, the more ineffective. So revolving door, we talked about this a little bit earlier when we talked about lobbyists, and this is just that action that some government officials will quit their jobs. And so those could be they don't get reelected, or they choose not to run again, or they worked in a bureaucratic agency and they want to leave to go be a lobbyist, because they can usually make way more money as a lobbyist than they could doing their regular government job. And so that's what we talk about, this revolving door, the idea that someone works in government for a little while and then leaves so that they can take advantage of that expertise that they built up and that access that they have to the machinery of government, so that they can make a lot of money on behalf of interest groups as a lobbyist rather, and try to contribute in that way. And that is the end. Do you have any questions? Well, if you do, you're gonna have to wait till you see me in class, or email me your questions or something like that. All right.